Now get comfortable in those great ergonomically correct chairs. Pull those shoulders back, sit up tall. Our next presenter is Dr. Christian Thompson. I had the pleasure of meeting him, I guess a few months ago, saw him present. He is one of the most sought after researchers, and what he's doing in the industry is another reason why I think he's been sought after as one of our newest members of the advisory board here at FAI. Little side note, when I met him, it was Super Bowl Sunday. The man is a very avid New England Patriots fan. So most of, I think, our conversation was that. So I hope that half of everybody walked out. They're starting to get up and walk out. But it turned out to be a good weekend for you. But great presenter, great information. Dr. Christian Thompson.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. That was Save Me San Francisco by train, by the way. So I'm at University of San Francisco as my primary day job, and then I also spend a lot of time out in the trenches at senior centers and other facilities working with older adults. I'm really excited to be here. I've got to thank Dan and Cody for the invitation, both for the advisory board and also to present with you today. You guys have done a terrific job. I've known Cody. We've been on each other's radar for over 10 years now, and we've been doing some work together at the American College of Sports Medicine through the Active Aging Interest Group. And if any of you do go to ACSM, how many of you have been to ACSM meetings in the past? Health Fitness Summit or annual meeting? Annual meeting? Okay, annual meeting, which is more of a research meeting. They do not play music when you walk up on the stage at a research meeting. Okay, it's no smiles, no laughs, no personality. And then the Health Fitness Summit, which I've been involved with for a very long time. So it's been great finally formalizing some stuff with Cody and meeting Dan and getting to meet all of you. So my goal today is to really provide you a little bit of programmatic input or programmatic guidance. I really like the way that Robert gave his presentation today, where he essentially said, there's a system, and all of us might have systems, or maybe we're looking to pull from different systems. I'm not here to tell you that the way that I approach exercise programming for fall prevention is the absolute only way or the absolute right way. You all with experience in the industry have access to a wealth of information, a wealth of equipment that you can incorporate into your training programs. I'm just going to try to emphasize some essential elements that need to be part of your exercise program when you're working with people who are concerned about falls, who have had falls, who are trying to prevent falls, who may have been referred to you through a physical therapist because of balance-related issues. There are some essential elements. And then you get to play around with those elements and figure out, how do I want to take the things that I like to do, that I'm good at, and incorporate those tools, those toys, those progressions in order to work most effectively with my clients, okay? So what I'd like to go through today is a little bit of a discussion about programming to prevent falls. There's a little bit of information that I'll give you in terms of background. Most of you know how significant of an issue falls are. It's not a pretty sight. Too many older people fall. We'll talk a bit about why that is. Why is it that people over the age of 65 have such an issue with falls? There are tons of risk factors out there, and unfortunately our own intrinsic balance control mechanisms end up not working as well, even without any disease pathology. Just healthy aging, we get older, and certain structures and parts of our body biologically age. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Then we're really going to start discussing putting together a training program, and it all starts from what I call assessment. I like that Robert said, maybe we don't call it assessment. Maybe we call it observation. Assessment, we get people trying to do things that maybe they don't do normally, or they modify their movements based on trying to impress somebody. So perhaps what I'm going to take away from his presentation is incorporating the assessments we're going to see and practice a bit today into more of an informal sort of a setting, so I can get a sense of what their capabilities are truly out there in the world. And then from those assessments, we're going to talk about a specific strategy to take assessment results, translate them into program design, and ensure that we can really individualize a fall prevention training program for virtually any older adult. Obviously, something's better than nothing, but doing the right thing is the absolute best. So let's talk briefly about some falls data. Pretty sobering stuff. The number has dropped a little bit in terms of percentage. It's now right around 25% of older adults fall every year. It was about a third of older adults about 6-7 years ago. However, now we have millions and millions more older adults than we had back then. So in fact, there are more falls as a total number occurring in 2018 than there would have been back in 2010. How many of you work with clients who have actually had a fall in the past? How many of your clients do you think are concerned about and really don't want to fall again? How many have verbalized to you part of the reason why they're seeing you is because they don't want to fall again? Falls are on the minds of older adults, even very active older adults. I find that somebody doesn't need to be a very deconditioned person who has trouble getting out of bed or trouble walking out the front door to go to the mailbox. It could be a person who is living a very active life. They're hiking regularly. They're out doing masters athletic competitions regularly. Whatever they're doing, they might be pushing the boundaries of their capabilities and putting themselves at risk. So falls are a concern for the entire continuum of older adults, not just those people that maybe we picture as struggling with the very basic of their activities of daily living. Clearly, the medical costs are significant, and the social costs are significant too. Caregiving. Anybody here caregive for somebody who had an injury from a fall? It's tough work, right? What type of fracture or injury? Okay, so you saw a number of people who were recovering from falls. Okay, anything from traumatic head injuries all the way down to fractures and things of that nature. Stroke as well. Sure, it's a lot of work. I mean, there's a study going on at UCSF Medical Center that's specifically geared to reduce the health risks associated with caregiving, because caregiving is a tough job. And most people who caregive, they spend their time caring for someone else. They don't spend so much time caring for themselves. So that in and of itself is a big challenge. So the costs are rough. Emotionally, socially, people are less likely to engage in their life because they're afraid about falling again. They don't want to go out into a situation that might put them at risk. Unfortunately, the less active they are, the more their risk continues to increase, because ultimately it becomes a vicious cycle. We've got a lot of fractures. Unfortunately, I'm going to go visit my mom in Naples after this meeting. And my mom, us Thompsons, we tend to be pretty stubborn. She decided, I live in Naples. I'm going to stick around for Hurricane Irma back in October. Well, she stuck around for Irma with two of her friends. Two of the three of them ended up in the emergency room 4 days later. One of the guys, he had a heart attack, my mom fell, and she broke her hip. Okay, this is not good. This is unfortunate. So these are things that happen, though, unfortunately, and very often hip fractures particularly can be very concerning within about a year. So we want to ensure that we're trying to manufacture some programs that will help them either recover from or prevent in the first place. And over 50% of people who make it through a hip fracture, they never return truly back to their original level of function. And oftentimes that level of function wasn't that great in the first place. So we see these steep drop-offs that end up affecting their quality of life over time. And obviously with the numbers that are happening, I think Cody's going to talk a bit later today about demographics and trends and things occurring within this industry and within this demographic. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. 10,000 people a day are turning the age of 65. So that really is increasing the risk population that we have. Okay, some of the factors that affect falls. So we really generally look at these risk factors. They were quantified initially back in the 1980s by Mary Tinetti. Mary Tinetti, one of the great researchers from Yale, and one of the first gerontologists to really bring onto the public consciousness and understanding of the importance of falls with older adults. And she quantified over 160 different risk factors associated with falls. Now, in 2018, we can add a bunch more, most of them having to do with being distracted by technology, right? There was no iPhone back there, so staring at iPhone was not an extrinsic risk factor. It sure as heck is now. We had a lot of things, weather and outdoor conditions. Those are oftentimes big-time challenges for older adults. If somebody lives in wintry weather conditions, it might be best for them to stay inside on days where it's icy, snowy outside. In San Francisco, it gets windy, it gets wet, really bad sidewalks in the city. Similar to a lot of other cities, they might want to stay in on days like that. Oftentimes when they are inside, there's clutter in the house, there are obstacles in the house, things that they might not even recognize are risk factors for falls. They might say, you know, I want to make the inside of my shower less likely for me to trip, so I'm going to put down one of those suction cup mats. Well, unfortunately, those suction cup mats tend to bunch up and become tripping hazards themselves. So there's a whole area of looking at home hazard risk reduction. And there's some materials I can refer you to online. Better to go with those abrasive strips. Those catch the foot and help you stop from a slip much more effectively than things that move, such as those bathroom mats. Additionally, poor lighting, lack of adaptive devices. Many people that I know growing up in New England, they had these multi-level old colonial houses. Oftentimes the front steps were these big brick steps without railings or railings way over on the sides. So it was very, very risky for them just to negotiate their home environments without potentially having an issue. Inappropriate footwear and clothing. And then we go to the intrinsic factors. These are things that are going on within the individual himself or herself. And there are a bunch of them. And unfortunately, oftentimes they come together. So a history of falling, that can lead to, especially the repeat offenders. About 12% of older adults fall more than once a year. So, 25%, you can think, well, everybody can have a fall. I probably fell within the last year, but it doesn't worry me because it just might have been something I was playing a sport, doing whatever. But if we start getting people who fall over and over and over again, those are our repeat offenders. Those are people who there's clearly something going on. Likely both extrinsic and intrinsic risk factors that are leading to their potential issue of having another fall. So a history of falling, when somebody says they've fallen twice or more, red flag. Chronic diseases, medical conditions. Colin Milner, who is a fantastic presenter, a great guy. His International Council on Active Aging is an amazing organization. You could consider looking into it if you haven't already. He was basically saying, chronic conditions. About 80+% of older adults come to us with a chronic condition. In fact, on average, 3 chronic conditions and 5 medications for the average person over the age of 65. And when you add those together and look at the interaction of those diseases and interaction of those medications, it becomes a serious, serious problem. Sensory and vestibular impairments. Almost everybody has vision issues, inner ear issues that will eventually become a problem in their life. And oftentimes, even before it's clinically manifested, it can be manifested in increasing fall risk. Medication and poor nutrition, and then obviously functional level. Things like muscle function, gait, balance, strength, power. All of those factors are majorly huge. And these are the ones that we can actually do a lot of stuff about. We can actually modify many of these intrinsic risk factors. Let's talk briefly about our 3 falls defense systems and how they really change with age. Okay? We have 3 primary systems. Michol earlier basically called them the ocular motor reflex, the vestibular motor reflex, and proprioception. You'll also hear them referred to as the vestibular system, the vision system, and also the somatosensory system. Vestibular system, in the inner ear, fluid-filled structures that allow us to determine what direction we're moving in, at what speed we're moving, if our body is turning, if our body is moving straight, if we're stationary. And this vestibular system is filled with fluid and has little tiny hair-like projections that line these structures. Well, as we get older, we tend to start, losing our hair. Not just on our head, in our head. These vestibular apparatuses, they begin to lose their sensitivity because the little hairs that are in there either start to fall out, they become desensitized, and before we know it, it takes more for our brain to detect motion before we're able to react to it. So things like postural sway. You might just be standing and talking to an older adult and you're noticing that they're swaying quite a bit. They might not even be aware of that because their primary systems that are meant to detect that movement just don't have the sensitivity that they used to have. And if they lack that sensitivity, it means it's going to take more movement for them to initiate a corrective response. And by that time, it's possible that corrective response might be too late. So, unfortunately, part of that biological aging process is the vestibular system losing some of its sensitivity. The visual system, eye changes, not just with people who have disease pathologies, glaucoma, cataracts, issues with the retina, but specifically an individual who is older has a thickened retina or a thickened cornea. All of us have that. Our cornea, the outer surface of the eye, begins to get thicker. That scatters light into our field of vision. Older people generally don't like driving at night, don't like being outside looking into light because it disperses across their whole field of vision and becomes potentially a dangerous hazard. So normal aging can affect both of those systems, and the somatosensory system, consisting of all of the afferent nerve endings in our feet, our toes, our digits, our ankles, our knees, our hips, our spine, but we're really looking primarily right where we're contacting the ground. These nerve endings are highly sensitive. They should be. They can respond to touch and pressure. They can detect the start of movement. They can detect the speed of movement. They can detect the end of movement. And we've got a number of different mechanoreceptors, joint receptors, skin receptors that are able to do that. And they group into what we call the somatosensory system. They're all intended to inform the brain of the position the body's in, what the body is doing, what kind of surface the body is walking on, if the body is stable on that surface or not. And then the brain starts to determine what's my most effective movement pattern to be safe and successful in this environment. Well, as we get older, just the simple process of building collagen, something that Michol talked about. I've known Michol for about 10 years. This is a guy who, from a background of science perspective, I love talking with him. He and I will get together and we'll literally talk for half an hour on Ruffini endings and Pacinian corpuscles, like these random, bizarre little proprioceptive structures within our body. Because he understands that these structures are very, very sensitive and they can be affected by a lot of stuff. As we get older, we build more collagen in our joint structures. Our joint structures become more stiff. Most of these proprioceptors respond to and are turned on by motion. If we reduce the motion within these joint structures and the elements of our body that we need to get good information from, we start getting less information up to our brain, and then we integrate maybe movement patterns that aren't as effective. We call that poor sensory motor integration. So all three of these balance control systems get less sensitive and put us at a greater risk for falls. So anybody over the age of 65, even a master's athlete, will see some decrements and deficits in these three areas. So ultimately, what can we do about living in a world where there are 160 plus different risk factors for falls, living in a world where our three balance control mechanisms that are specifically there to help us stay standing, as they start to get a little bit less effective, what can we do about it? Well, one choice is to do less, right? I'm going to remove myself from dangerous environments. I'm going to remove myself from dangerous situations. And that's where that whole wellness component model starts to crash, because it's all intricately connected. If somebody starts to pull away socially, they start to pull away intellectually. If somebody starts to pull away physically, they start to pull away psychologically. There are so many different connections in that dimensions of wellness. So instead of doing less, the evidence really suggests that we need to do more. And we know from research that started back in the early 1990s that exercise really can help. But we do need to choose the right type of exercise. Interesting, this area of exercise research is still somewhat in its infancy, and we still don't know that much about how all of these components that should be in a fall prevention program need to come together and integrate. What we love to do as fitness professionals is let's find the recommendations. What are the numbers? How many sets? How many reps? How much weight? What's the intensity? What's the frequency? So we learn about that. Any organization you get certified through, whether it's NSCA, whether it's ACSM, whether it's another certifying agency, NASM, etc., they'll give you blueprints on how to construct your training program. And oftentimes a focus of that blueprint will be your loading. How often, how much, how intense, how much rest, how much work, all of these different variables. With fall prevention, we really haven't developed a specific prescription as of yet. We know elements that should be in a training program, but we haven't nailed down through really good longitudinal studies as of yet what the absolute right prescription is. And it's probably because the absolute right prescription for one person is very unlikely to be the absolute right prescription for another person. That person who had a fall on the trail on a hike, who hikes 4 or 5 times a week, likely has a different mix of their exercise prescription for the elements that affect fall risk than a person who has trouble getting out of a chair and getting over to the restroom or getting out to the mailbox. So we have to really be thinking from an individualizing perspective when it comes to fall. Certain things that we do know, it appears that in order to truly reduce fall's occurrence, we need to train people for a while. Sherrington, about 4 years ago, came out with an exhaustive review study that determined that in order to truly reduce fall's occurrence, based on research that was looking at fall's occurrence or fall's reduction as an outcome, you need at least 50 hours of multi-component exercise training. So that could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on the frequency with which you're seeing your client, and also how often you're working with that individual and for what period of time. So that seems like a lot, and it's kind of a tough sell to tell somebody, well, I can't guarantee you're not going to fall over the next couple of months, but if you stick with it, 6 months from now, you're going to be in a lot better shape. So what we really like to do is more look at the elements that relate to fall risk. So the functional variables that can be associated with fall risk: muscle strength, muscle power, joint mobility, static balance, dynamic balance, gait speed. These are the performance factors that we all know sort of come into this big giant recipe for a reduction in risk. So we need to make sure that we can at least start with the elements that are going to affect these different risk factors and ensure that we choose the correct components to address those. As such, at this point, there's really not a lot of strong evidence pointing toward cardiovascular training as being an effective fall risk reduction strategy. Not to say that cardiovascular exercise is not important, particularly perhaps higher intensity metabolic training. Okay? There's great research that's coming out. I mean, right now, you cannot read a scientific journal without essentially high intensity training being the primary exercise prescription that's being studied. And it's pretty clear at this point that generally high-intensity training gets larger and more rapid responses physiologically than moderate-intensity training, and generally has been found to be as safe, if not even safer, and better tolerated by people who have even very compromised clinical conditions. So I think it's fascinating that high-intensity training has really generated this sort of momentum. And from a perspective of an academic, I don't think it's a fad. I mean, it's definitively something that is truly backed by science. And the nice thing is it's kind of fun to do. It's fun to program that with your clients. They like doing stuff. They like feeling athletic. They like feeling fast. They like feeling powerful. They like feeling strong. However, cardiovascular training in and of itself, if we're just saying, okay, we're going to go out and walk, just going out and walking is not going to improve gait to the point that it reduces fall risk. Most people will go out and walk with their normal gait. And if it's a dangerous gait, they're going to be walking with that dangerous gait. If we have them do some other cardiovascular exercise, it's not necessarily going to improve their vestibular function or their visual function. It's not necessarily going to improve their balance either. So although it's an important element to having an older person be able to enjoy their life and be able to have energy. In fact, Kenneth Cooper, how many of you guys know Ken Cooper or have heard of Ken Cooper, the Cooper Clinic of aerobic research? Ken Cooper spoke at ACSM 2 years ago. And he put out a statistic that astounded me. You guys might want to write this one down too. Based on their research, and they're all into aerobic training and aerobic assessment, and have determined that it's actually better to be fit but fat than normal weight and unfit from a cardiovascular standpoint. The risk of death is much higher if you are unfit and normal weight than you are if you are overweight or even obese but cardiovascularly fit. Ken Cooper said this. He said, if a 75-year-old person can walk a mile in 17 minutes, that's just under 4 miles an hour. 75-year-old walk a mile in under 17 minutes, they have about an 85% chance of making it to the age of 90. It's that strong of a predictor, having a good cardiovascular system. If 15 years in the future you'll still be alive if you can walk a 17-minute mile at the age of 75. So one of the big goals when I go see my mom is making sure she's back up on her feet and reminding her, okay, you're back to walking. Now let's start working on walking a little faster, Mom. We want to get you up to that 17-minute mile at some point. You made it through this bump in the road, but you got to keep pushing it. We got to return you back to that level of function. Before she fell, she could do that. I'm not sure if she can now, but we're going to push to get back there. Additionally, just general strengthening, stretching exercises, yoga, those have not shown any convincing evidence of reducing falls occurrence. Not to say they're not good. As an older person, it's really important to be a jack of all trades, okay? There's going to be a weak link in there somewhere. I think that's what Michelle was talking about, kind of a weak link of a chain, okay? When it comes to different components of fitness and different activities that older adults can engage in, if they miss one, they skip one, they don't like to do one or more, those become the weak links. And those are the weak links that will eventually take them down. So as an older person, Dr. Walter Bortz, who wrote a book called Dare to Be 100, he basically said, in youth, exercising is a choice. In old age, exercising is mandatory. We have to do it. And we have to choose a lot of different types of exercise. Because if you're not a jack of all trades, that one or more that you ignore or don't spend as much time on, that's going to be the weak link. And eventually that will be the link that takes somebody down. From a fall prevention standpoint, the evidence points to a few different areas. Joint mobility and stability, this thing that Michelle was talking about. Ensuring that not only can we move a joint through a full range of motion or move the body through different movement patterns, but also show stability while doing so. Gary Gray, a physical therapist, calls that most stability. Most stability, having mobility and stability as one. Sensory enhancement, these sensory mechanisms that we talked about earlier, vestibular system, visual system, somatosensory system, these systems can be trained. They can get better. And if we don't have those elements in our training program, it becomes much more difficult for an older person to be successful out in their environment because inevitably they're going to be walking across the street. They might have to turn, look for traffic as they're carrying their groceries. If they don't really have the training and the ability to make up for some compromises in those systems, when we start doing those multitasking sort of activities, they can have a big problem. Muscle performance, both muscle strength and muscle power. Both muscle strength and muscle power. Very, very important. Static and dynamic balance, being able to move and maintain our balance, or being able to stay still and maintain our balance in different movement planes. Very, very important. And then also focusing on not just walking, but the way somebody walks, in order to ensure that the changes that we see with gait as we get older are at least recognized and focused on to some degree in one's training program. There are a lot of modifications a person makes to their gait that they think are going to make them safer. They widen their stance, they take shorter and choppier steps, they involve more upper body sort of weight shifting laterally as they step. All of those might make them feel safer, but the evidence shows that those strategies actually put them at greater risk for falls and can exacerbate things that are problematic for them already, like maybe osteoarthritis. Our body's not meant to walk the way that they're adopting a strategy to walk, so now their hip, their back, etc., are going to hurt more than they hurt before. Okay. But I think what I've learned through, I guess we started our community intervention in San Francisco at the senior centers back in 2005, is that we really need to do what we can to individualize our training programs as much as possible. So we have a program called Always Active in San Francisco. We just celebrated our 11th year in existence. We have about 19 senior centers around the city where we implement, among other things, general conditioning programs and fall prevention classes. And for the first several years, these classes were done in large groups. My fall prevention classes done in large groups. And we actually found efficacy. So I've presented a couple of times, and I've got a manuscript that is in second review now with the Translational Journal of ACSM. Hopefully will be published sometime later this year, looking at the actual reduction in fall risk doing a progressive 12-week exercise training program consisting of these different elements that we know are important with reducing fall risk. But although these data were able to show us some really good outcomes for older adults, I recognize just by watching them that everybody's presenting with a different issue. Everyone's got different pain points. Everyone's got different strengths and weaknesses. Even if they look the same on paper. Oh yeah, I was out for a hike and I fell. Oh, okay, well Mary was out for a hike and she fell too. It's possible they fell for completely different reasons because of different physical factors. Maybe they scored the same number on an assessment. Well, just because they scored the same number on an assessment, it's possible the reason that they scored the same on the assessment were for issues dealing with two different task demands with that particular assessment. So the more I observed these folks, I started to really recognize that we needed to drill down even more and try to individualize these programs as much as we can. So what we do now is we go through an assessment strategy and we normalize results for all of the participants into either generally low, moderate, or high function. And then we choose specific exercise domains to match with each of the assessments, and then we ensure that they work in small groups with a group that fits their profile. So it might be, here we've got Harry. He's going through a mobility ladder. He's got his hand on a wall, taking him just through a basic forward stepping strategy. Later, Harry might be doing a visual challenge sensory stimulation exercise, just standing in place. Well, Virginia and Judy, they scored differently on their assessments, and they are actually doing an ambulatory visual challenge exercise. They are much more progressed, but maybe only progressed in that area. Perhaps Harry has stronger legs. He scores higher on a chair stand test. So Harry might be doing a more advanced chair stand or lower body strength and lower body power exercise than Judy and Virginia. So it's so important to try to ensure that you're developing a strategy where you can find very specifically what people do well, what people do okay, and what people don't do so well. And make sure that you not necessarily only work on the things they don't do well, but have them do relatively regressed exercises for things they don't do well, and relatively progressed exercises for things that they do well. So it's not necessarily about choosing one domain over another, because again, we have to be jacks of all trades. We have to be able to do all of it. It's just how challenging will these different exercises be. Okay, so how do we get started? And again, this is what our process is. I'm hopeful that this process will be at least somewhat helpful to all of you. What's the process? First of all, we have to identify the balance control deficits, we have to construct our corrective strategies, and then we have to modify based on functional capabilities. Pretty simple. So, identifying balance control deficits, we have adopted a 3-assessment strategy. And the reason why we adopted it is because, the world has a lot of assessments, right? How many of you guys think we need a new assessment? I mean, there are assessments all over the place. There are clinical assessments, there are fitness assessments, there are objective outcome measurements that are either seconds or time or reps or inches or whatever it might be. There are very subjective movement-based assessments. There are multiple planes of motion. There are ones for different sports. I mean, it's pretty crazy. And ultimately, I even use various assessments on my older adults depending on what they're interested in doing and what they are good at doing. I work with a lot of golfers. That was kind of what I did when I first moved to San Francisco. I'd done some golf research before. I worked with some golfers as I started connecting with senior centers. So I just went to a golf course first because it takes a while to integrate in the community. And I said, hey, let's do some fun conditioning. They said, sure. So Titleist has the TPI, Titleist Performance Institute. Get certified in TPI, and then you learn a specific assessment strategy for golfers. Not necessarily the only thing you can do with golfers, but they have movement observations that are associated and actual objective measurements that are associated with how well somebody might play golf and how injury-free they might be able to play. Really what it comes down to is how effectively does that assessment apply to one's daily life, right? And that's ultimately, we all know the principle of specificity. That's specificity for an assessment. Are you actually asking the person to do in this assessment things that they're going to be normally doing throughout the course of their normal life? Or are you giving them some unusual assessment that they probably are never going to be doing in the first place, doesn't quite fit with how they live their lives? And then secondarily, we need to ensure that the assessment has a level of challenge that is both appropriate and sensitive enough to be able to separate out people that are functioning well versus people that aren't functioning well. Does it give us a good continuum of outcomes? If it's just pass-fail, or if you put an assessment in front of an older adult and let's take FMS. How many of you guys use FMS? I love FMS. Okay, functional movement screen. It's fantastic. Gray Cook, FMS is great. You try to get an older adult into the inline lunge position, where they're basically standing in a widened tandem stance, and they've got their bar up on their back, and now they basically need to do an inline lunge from this position. Just getting them into the prep position for that, or the hurdle step, where they have to step, balance over a bar, just getting into the preparatory position for some of those assessments. Or an overhead squat. How many of you guys use overhead squat with some of your clients? Okay, overhead squat assessment, very common, very appropriate. Except if you have an older adult, you start checking yes on everything. Arms fall forward, yes. Elbows bend, yes. Knees cave inward, yes. Feet turn outward, yes. Low back rounds, yes. Next thing you look at your assessment, where do I start? I have no clue where to start. Everything's a yes. I guess I have to do absolutely everything. So not a sensitive assessment for this particular population. So you have to really find what's going to be able to provide you good performance, average performance, poor performance. Those are probably the right assessments to choose for this particular group. And ultimately, I think that's what functional means, to be able to be both specific and sensitive to a person's daily life. So the assessments that we use what we call the reach test. It's a modification to what's called the functional reach test. We'll talk about it in a moment. You'll see a little video. And we've determined that the reach test is the best test for us to really get an idea of a person's functional capabilities as it relates to joint mobility and stability, and also static balance. Because those are the performance factors that are necessary to successfully complete the task demands associated with the reach test. We'll see it in a second, but basically you're standing with your feet hip width apart, fist, reaching forward, coming back, measuring the displacement that somebody can reach. Okay? Joint mobility, they have to be able to hinge their hips, they have to be able to rotate their torso, they have to be able to protract at the scapula. Static balance, they're moving their center of pressure, they need to be able to maintain balance in a somewhat challenged balance position. Great assessment. Timed up and go test, very, very common test. All these tests, by the way, came out of the clinical world first, just like a lot of our exercise programming. We borrow and we take a lot of things from the clinical world that we know help with rehab, and we apply it to prehab, to training our clients so that they get better and they don't get hurt and they don't have problems in the future. Timed up and go test. A lot of tasks associated with it. We use that as our dynamic balance and our gait assessment. And then the 30-second chair stand test, part of, you'll see a number of lower body strength tests. Maybe it's five repetition sit to stand test. 30-second chair stand test I like because it implies that the person's trying to do as many as they can, so muscle power, especially initially, how quickly they can move. Also muscle endurance, and you can really observe what happens as they start to get fatigued during the test. They start showing some dysfunctional movement patterns. So 30 seconds gives us a good time frame for that. And that helps to quantify muscle performance. So those are the three assessments we use. They each really focus on different performance characteristics and give us a good global idea of a person's relative risk for falls. Okay, I'm going to take you through a brief video of each of these assessments. I will also let you know that they are on my YouTube channel. Okay, I think I have a link to my YouTube channel, but maybe I didn't. Whoopsie. That would be youtube.com, Thompson Fitness Salute. I didn't want it to be too long. It already is too long. So I didn't want to add on the I-O-N-S. I mean, come on. Thompson Fitness Salute, as if you're starting the word solutions. And it's got 3 S's in a row. It's kind of weird. Thompson Fitness Salute, so it looks bizarre. But a lot of videos there, including how to perform these 3 different assessments. Okay? Let's watch Alex.
This is the reach test. This is an assessment of joint mobility and static balance. I have Alex here today to help demonstrate the reach test. We have a yardstick on the wall directly at shoulder height. What we're going to have Alex do is stand with his feet shoulder width apart, his left hand at his side. Alex will make a fist with his right hand and lift it up at the height of the ruler. We'll make sure his shoulders are square. Take an initial measurement, 21 inches, and now he'll reach and hold his finish position. 12.5 inches. Stand back up. So that was an 8.5 inch reach. We would then check on the left side as well. Great job, Alex.
Okay, so a few things about that assessment, okay? First of all, slightly limited base of support, not super wide between hip and shoulder width. And we try to ensure that the individual reaches as far forward as possible, maintains that hold position for a moment before coming back up to stand. So holding that reach position is all about being able to stabilize when the center of pressure has been moved in the forward direction while having reached the maximum joint mobility that they have for hips, torso rotation, protraction of the shoulder. A few things that you'll notice, and these might be little points that you want to keep an eye on. Very often they start pre-reaching. So they're starting with the shoulders already protracted. Make sure the shoulders are square. Actually, really good to actually hold the hand in that position, get them back to square shoulders as you get the starting measure. Then make sure they progress out, heels stay on the floor. Ideally, the hand stays directly at the height of the ruler. You saw that Alex dropped a little bit there. He got a little bit below the ruler. Okay, that was a little choke on my part. Additionally, it's important to see, well, if they can't keep their arm at the height of the ruler, why is that? Why is that? Are they rolling at the back? Are they getting very kyphotic during their reach? Are they going more toward the ground? Are they having trouble hinging from the hip, so they have to find that mobility somewhere else? So by watching how they perform that reach, it starts giving you an idea of why the results are what they are. So you have to, I would recommend, measure a couple of trials and then observe a couple of trials and watch the quality of the movement. And we also say do it on both sides. If there's more than a 2-inch difference between a right side and a left side reach, there's probably a joint mobility issue going on. Maybe bilateral or unilateral hip tightness, maybe torso rotation issues. Many people clearly have a dominant side. Robert was talking about that. They'll even be standing already pre-rotated in one direction versus the other. So these are movement dysfunctions that can be identified, and then you can go down more assessments to figure out exactly what's going on with that particular observation. But this is really good for us to quantify those two important elements. Then the walk test, dynamic balance and gait enhancement, modified from what's called the timed up and go test. This is a great test, probably the most commonly used clinical assessment in physical therapy in geriatrics, because it involves task demands that are essential for an older adult to be able to live an independent life. Can they get up from a chair? Yes or no? Can they walk straight line ambulation? Yes or no? Can they rotate their body during ambulation? And can they do that effectively? Or are they stumbling or staggering along? Yes or no? Can they eccentrically control themselves back to the chair? Yes or no? There's a lot of rich information that you can derive from the timed up and go test. So the walk test, we actually modified a little bit to fast but safe speed. It was initially taught walking at one's normal pace. Normal pace is nice, but we know that gait speed and being able to control oneself while walking, gait speed is huge. It's called the 6th vital sign for a reason. It's got such a high predictor of mortality and morbidity. It's so related to bad outcomes if somebody starts walking too slow. Anybody ever see Barry Franklin, Dr. Barry Franklin, present at any conference before? Okay, Dr. Barry Franklin from Detroit. He's a cardiologist in Beaumont's Hospital, past president of ACSM. He is all about gait speed. Okay, he basically says you have to walk faster than the Grim Reaper. And the Grim Reaper walks basically 1 meter per second. So if you walk slower than 1 meter per second, you're in big trouble. And he's got this little animation where a guy's walking and the Grim Reaper's right behind him with his little sickle. It's pretty fun. Okay, so fast but safe gives that, okay, we want you to be moving quickly. We want to see how effectively and how confident somebody is to be able to walk at a fast speed. Gives you a really good idea of what their balance confidence is during motion. If they're guarded with their gait, that can be a big clue to you that they have very low balance confidence. Okay, so let's watch it. And again, the outcome measurement this time is in time, closest hundredth of a second. And here's the walk test. Alex is back in action.
This is the walk test. This assessment is our assessment for gait enhancement and dynamic balance. I have Alex here helping me with the walk test. What we're going to have him do is see how quickly he can walk around the cone, come back and sit down. Here's what the test is going to look like. Alex is starting the test with his feet flat on the floor, his hands on his lap. When I say go, he's going to stand up, walk as fast as he's comfortable around the cone, come back and sit down. I'm going to time him on the stopwatch to the closest 1/100th of a second. That's it. Alex, let's do this test. I will give you a ready, set, go command. Ready, set, go. Around the cone, and come back and have a seat. 8.92 seconds. Very good.
Okay, so the back of the cone here, the part of the cone furthest away from the chair, that is exactly 3 meters. Okay, that's almost 10 feet. 3 meters away, that's the standardization for that test. They kick over the cone, you set the cone back, put a piece of tape down there so you know where the back edge of the cone needs to be, redo the test. Always good to brace the back of the chair. When they get up, oftentimes they'll kind of push off, the chair will move, so ensure the chair stays in the same position. Always cue. As soon as they stand up, just say around the cone. They know, okay, my goal is, oh, I got to go around the cone. They go around the cone. Then your cue is come back and sit down. That way they're not picking the cone up. They're not going off into space somewhere. You know, it makes things very, very simple. Okay, really, really excellent test. Again, here Alex could have probably walked faster, but we wanted to have this very clear when he was in the process of walking. Our third test for muscle strength, muscle power, is the 30-second chair stand test. We call it the stand test. We modified it a bit from Rickley and Jones. Okay, it measures lower body strength and power, its number of repetitions in 30 seconds. Here's Alex going on the stand test, and you can imagine what this is.
This
Arms
test is
across
called the
chest.
stand test. This is an assessment of lower body strength. Very important. I have Alex here helping me out. This test will start with his arms across his chest, and when I say go, he will stand up fully and sit down as many times as he can in 30 seconds. I'll time him on this stopwatch. All right, Alex, ready, go. 1,
Important points. Make sure they
2,
fully
keep
stand
going.
up. Very often
Notice
they'll get
how
up
Alex
to
is fully standing
partial
up
standing,
and he is making
ensure it's
contact
full
with the
standing.
chair on every
You
repetition.
say all the
That's
way up.
very important
That's
for
your
this
cue.
test.
If
Keep
they
on
don't
going.
touch
You're
the
doing
chair,
great.
all
This
the
is
way
6,
down. They don't need to fully sit,
7,
but they do need to make
keep
contact.
going, 8, 9,
Arms need to stay against the chest.
10, very
None
good.
of this momentum
11,
motion. It's getting a
and
little bit of
stop.
that going.
That's 11 repetitions in 30 seconds. Excellent work.
He's pumped. He's proud of himself. Good job, Alex. All right. Alex did a good job. Okay, so from that information, we have enough to construct some corrective strategies. So feel free to take a picture of this. Here are our scores based on over 300 people now that have gone through our fall prevention program in San Francisco. I think we're gaining on 400. Okay? And we rate each of these. This would be the reach test, walk test, stand test, and we rate 5 different quintiles. Poor, 20th percentile or below, below average, average, above average, excellent. So we've got a range. We've got a range for each of these. And ultimately, based on how effectively they score on each of those 3 assessments, it's very likely that they'll do better on one of them than the other 2. Maybe they'll do great on all 3. Maybe they'll do poorly on all 3. But very likely there's a strength and there's a weakness there. And that helps us in the selection of our exercise program design. So what we do, let's say we've got a fictional woman, Mary. Mary had a reach of 8.5 inches. She had a walk that took 7.42 seconds. She had a stand that took 11 repetitions. Okay? Her joint mobility and static balance exercises based on the reach test, she scored below average on the reach test based on our norms. That means she's going to get level 2 joint mobility and level 2 static balance exercises. She's going to get a slightly regressed static balance exercise on a 5-exercise spectrum. So because she scored in the second quintile, that should say quintile, not quartile, she would get a level 2 exercise. Dynamic balance, her score on dynamic balance was very, very good. It was above average. 7.42 seconds puts her in the above average category. So she gets more challenging dynamic balance and gait enhancement exercises. Okay, so she'll get level 4 exercises or progressed exercises for dynamic balance and gait enhancement. Her stand test result was average. That will put her in the 3rd quartile, basically in that kind of 40 to 60 percentile. And that will give her level 3 exercises for muscle strength and muscle power. So her program is variable. If I were to be doing a group exercise class where everyone's getting level 3 exercises, we'd be hitting it on the head with her for the muscle performance exercises, but we'd be pushing her maybe a little too much and in an unsafe manner for her joint mobility and static balance exercises, and we would be under challenging her for dynamic balance and gait. So by having assessments that focus on identifying these different domains that come into fall prevention exercise, it really helps us individualize specifically a program for each person. So let's take a look at what this might look like. Again, I think Michel was talking a little bit about the ankle and the hip. He was talking about joint mobility, joint stability. Ankle and hip are so key. Joint mobility and stability in all parts of the body are essential as we get older, no question. And ultimately, the ankle and the hip will then integrate with the motion at the spine, at the shoulder as well. So we use our ankle and our hip to help us recover balance during standing and movement. Ankle strategies, we typically use our ankles. We don't really have a lot of movement in the knees and the hips during this postural sway. Just a little bit of motion at the ankles. All we need is a little bit of motion to help us recover our balance. When we have bigger balance disturbances, we need to go to hip strategies. We have a larger displacement of the hips, which allows us to quickly correct our center of pressure. If we do not have flexible ankles, we do not have flexible hips, we have a very small ability to create those recovery motions, and now we're into compensatory stepping. Okay, now we're having to step to recover because we can't do it from a static position. And if we have trouble with recovering from a static position, and we need big strategies, stepping strategies, what happens when we're out walking and we trip over something? Now we might outweigh or outperform our compensatory strategies and the person hits the ground because they're already they're already way behind the curve in terms of the way they compensate for recovering their balance. And again, it was found back in 2005 that we get less proprioceptive information into our brain and worse outcoming movement patterns, the more stiff these joint complexes become. So the recommendation would be to do both open chain exercises and closed chain exercises. Open chain exercises just help us get more motion into that joint. We're doing ankle circles, we're doing ankle points and flexes, we're doing hip circles, we're doing bicycles with the hip, we're doing hip rotations. A lot of different exercises, you can think about 1,000 of them, that all relate to those two different joints, oftentimes integrated together, and we are going to try to increase neural drive to get the brain activating the muscles that move those joints, get those stiff joint structures warmed up, increase temperature to allow them to move more effectively. And then we start integrating them with closed chain exercises where they're having to respond to ground reaction forces. So something like a rotating punch, where we get rotation and stability, ankle, hip, thoracic spine, shoulder, all the way through the kinetic chain. And we start getting these joint structures working together to integrate balance. And that's the important thing. How well can we get them to work together? So we need to integrate them together and put people in, again, those specific situations they might find themselves in. And you can do reach backs, which would basically be an opposite rotating punch, cross body to opening. So now we get an anterior chain stretch versus more of a posterior chain movement. Muscle strength and power exercises, really interesting. Signorelli, a guy who, Joe Signorelli, big time involved with older adult strength and power research. He really emphasizes that muscle mass, while important, right? We all know that older adults have less muscle mass than younger adults. What's really important is muscle performance. And the relationship between the amount of muscle mass somebody has and how strong they are or how powerful they are, that relationship gets weaker as we get older. So we can't just rely on, is this an atrophied older person I'm looking at? We need to see, can this person produce force? Can this person move quickly? So we call a loss of power dynapenia. Sarcopenia is a loss of muscle mass. But dynapenia, the inability to move effectively and move quickly and produce force, that is more importantly related to fall risk and independent living. So assessments like the 30-second chair stand test, very good to really look at muscle performance rather than just how much muscle does a person have. And clearly, our goal might be, if we can get people up to Robert's level, where we're working with people doing very high-loaded resistance training, we're going to focus on preventing sarcopenia as well, because we now have a hypertrophy training program. Additionally, we need to really focus on eccentric control. We got to teach people to learn how to decelerate external force. It might be, okay, well, I need to decelerate myself on a chair stand and do a nice slow chair sit, or I need to decelerate myself as I'm recovering from the stumble that I just had over that curb. So being able to control oneself eccentrically is a very, very important aspect of training recoverability. Being fast, but also being able to control that eccentric motion. So that's really, really big. So chair stands, chair sits, and then things like stomps, really quick stomps, or boom, 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 rotating stomps. Maybe that's a level 4, level 5 exercise. But getting people being able to quickly control center of gravity motion and muscle force production. Rate of force development. I got about 10 seconds to go, but I'm going to go over by a minute. Ha ha. Sensory stimulation exercises. Guys, you can read some reviews. Even though we have those 3 systems, they work together. Trust me. They work together, and the best way to get them working better is by challenging at least one of them at a time. So if you start shifting your eyes, you're removing effectively vision. It puts more emphasis on your vestibular system and your somatosensory system to keep you on your feet. You start turning your head back and forth. You're mixing up the inner ear. You're challenging the vestibular system. Now your visual system and your somatosensory system need to work better to keep you on your feet. You get onto an unstable surface. Your somatosensory system is challenged. You learn with your vestibular system and your visual system to work better to keep you on your feet. So by challenging one, and sometimes even challenging 2 at a time, not totally removing them, but challenging them, you can improve the acuity of those 3 systems working together for balance maintenance, which is incredibly important. So things that you can do head turns either in a staggered position, a stationary position, and you can obviously apply a balance challenge with the surface here, or you could do something ambulating, where people are walking out in their environment. They're going to be doing that, and they're going to have challenges to their sensory systems out there in the world. Balance and gait exercises. Why not just, how many of you have seen, this is a great balance training exercise. I'm going to have everybody balance on one foot, right? And a lot of the basic literature you might read, they say, oh, well, train your people to balance on one foot. Unfortunately, falls happen generally during movement. And also, we monitor our body, those proprioceptors, that somatosensory system, they are turned on with movement. We can give ourselves a static balance challenge, but integrate movement in some way, shape, or form. Reach, do different challenging motions, which then you have to integrate and figure out how to stay on your feet, even with these static balance challenges. And really, when it comes down to it, they got to be challenging. If it's easy, forget about it. 75% success. Every 4th repetition might be a struggle, and that's okay. The wobble is your brain figuring it out. And then, guys, again, we modify based on functional capabilities. Somebody scores poorly on those assessments, they're going to have a very regressed exercise. Somebody scores better on those exercises, we might go from a wide stance to a narrow stance to a stagger stance to a tandem stance to a single leg stance. We might, if we're doing upper body resistance training, bilateral, unilateral, alternating, and then other modifiable factors. There are a ton of them. What type of support you're on, what type of stability of surface, do you have something to hold on to? Is it a hand, is it a fingertip? What types of exercise? Involving multi-joint, sensory modifications, turning the head, closing the eyes, standing on a foam pad, speed of movement. Sometimes fast is a progression, sometimes slower is a progression. It depends. Movement plane, are you ensuring that they can do these movements in all movement planes, right? We did that with Mashol. We're kind of in a sagittal setup and we're doing a frontal plane motion. You could also do a rotational plane motion. Just make sure you're challenging everything that person might be experiencing, right? So I know it's a lot, it's a ton of information. I'm hopeful that just this information in and of itself can help to provide you, again, a system that you can refer to if you need to develop some fall prevention training programs, and then add in all the bells and whistles you want. My only argument are these are the essential elements that need to be in there somewhere. And very soon to come out, we are going to have an online platform, which is an assessment and program design platform called Mobility Matters. You are all welcome. When this does come out, Dan, Cody, and I will make sure you're all aware of it. And the goal here is to give you a strategy for assessment we just talked about, and then also give you a broad library of solutions that you can put into place, and also provide some materials that your clients can work on at home, monitored, that you can ensure that they're doing what they need to do to keep themselves on their feet. Get them on their feet and keep them there. That's what fall prevention exercise is all about. Thank you very much. It's been great being here.